I think it's important as an EI practitioner that I go and put myself out there and take part in these events with people who are at a similar level to me and watch the 7th dance and the 8th dance and see what I'm aspiring to in a few years' time. To go to Japan, see phenomenal EI executed by people who are your age or in many cases a lot younger, it really does puts in perspective your training, but it also gives you something to really work towards. I'm a student of Lee-Steere Sensei, she's a student of Jodo Sensei. That's how I fit into the structure of things. It's very difficult for people to understand the nature of that relationship if they don't have someone to explicitly tell them about it.
Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Chikushinkai Inside Look podcast. Today we're speaking with Lee-Steere Sensei from Melbourne, Australia. Lee-Steere Sensei has been training for over 20 years, during which time he achieved the rank of Renshi Rokudan Iaido and Godan Jodo, and has been a major contributor to the Australian Kendo Renmei and Victoria Kendo Renmei. Lee-Steere Sensei founded the Chikushinkai Iaido Club in 2004 and has participated in training seminars and tournaments in Japan and Europe. In this episode, we talk about the general state of Iaido in Australia, the value of seeing Iaido in Japan, and the development of his sensei-student relationship, informed partially by episode 4 of this podcast with Peter West Sensei. It was great to see this show growing into much more of an ongoing conversation, and I hope to see this happen more often in the future. So without further ado, here's Lee-Steere Sensei.
So I started Iaido as a result of watching Kendo. I'd been living in the UK for 10 years. I'm from Western Australia originally, but I went to London on let's do 1 or 2 years in London and ended up staying 10, and came back to Australia in 1995. Down to Melbourne after I arrived in Sydney because got offered a job down here. In 1996, I saw an advert in the Sunday paper for a group here, which was the Melbourne Kendo Club, who were starting a beginner's course in Kendo. I thought, well, I'll go along and have a go. It interested me. I had an interest in Japanese culture, sort of peripherally, really. And so I started Kendo with them in 1990. And the Melbourne Kendo Club, as was then, had an Iaido class as well. And they would run EI for an hour and a half, Tuesday and Thursday evenings prior to kicking off with Kendo. And I'd sort of go to the club, sit there for an hour and a half or an hour after getting in from work, watching EI, and after a couple of years of this, decided that I'd probably might as well join in. Can't do any harm, can it really? It was interesting enough, and I might enjoy that. So I started with them in January 1999 in Iaido. Basically 2 years later, I'd given up on the Kendo and was doing Iaido only, and then a little while later started up Jodo as well, which was through another student at the Kenshikan, had picked up some Jodo over the years, and we basically just started a study group at the Kenshikan on Jodo. So I was then doing Iaido and Jodo with no Kendo. I have kept my Kendo registration current with the Kendo Renmei. I am a second kyu, which is not terribly significant, but I've kept my registration current because I think, and I've thought this for a long time, never done a lot about it, that there's not enough cooperation or working together between the Kendo and EI communities. I mean, they're all under the one Renmei, but they do tend to function largely independently. And we do, in our EI club, run Kendo kata sessions from time to time. It's the one thing I basically remember from Kendo. And we have a Kendo kata competition in the Victorian Kendo Championship here. And at some stage, I don't know whether it's going to be now or in 10 years' time, I think I'm going to join with one of the local Kendo clubs and take part in the kata comp. This is the theory anyway. It may not work, but that's the plan. So that's why I've kept the Kendo registration current, but haven't picked up Shinai in a long time.
When you started Iaido, when you were watching Iaido, were there many people that were doing both Kendo and Iaido? You said it's from the same club.
Yeah, at that stage, a lot of people were. There was a lot of people doing both Kendo and EI, and the bulk of people doing EI were Kendo students. That's certainly not the case anymore. I mean, nationally in Australia, we've got about 250 people practicing EI, and I would think probably 50 or 60 of those also do Kendo. So it's gone from being the majority back in those days to being very much those who do both arts in the minority. I started my club in 2004, but at that stage I've been training for nearly 5 years. When I started EI, there were 2 clubs in Melbourne, in Victoria and Melbourne, 1 in the country, in Ballarat. There are now 7. And I started in 1999. In 2000, we had the first of the new style of national seminar and championships, basically a 1-week event. The first one in 2000 wasn't a 1-week event, but that was the event that kicked it off. We had a big delegation of sensei come down from Japan. The Australian Kendo Renmei appointed 2 new technical advisors, Oda Sensei, Katsuo Oda Sensei for Iaido, and Kuniaki Nagayama Sensei for Jodo. So it gave a big push to the art nationally. We saw through that first 10-year period, big growth in clubs, big growth in membership, at least relatively from a small base. And that's sort of, I think that's really sort of I wouldn't say stagnated, it stayed fairly consistent from its sort of 2010 to 2012 base. It grew a lot in the first 10 years and it's sort of been steady since then. But back in those early days, we were all younger and excited, and this predates Google. So, not a lot of information online, such as it was, about Iaido, and everything we were doing was new and exciting. And it was very exciting and very interesting to meet Japanese sensei. They'd come down once a year, and we would have a group of between 5 and 7 sensei come to Australia every January to teach at a big national seminar. And for the first 10, 12 years, that's how it went, which is very exciting.
So what motivated this establishment of this large seminar and the technical advisors?
I think it was really the time. Kendo Sensei in the Melbourne Kendo Club at the time had a close relationship with Haga Sensei in Japan, and I think he wanted to see some more development of Iaido and Jodo, or Iaido initially, and subsequently Jodo, but certainly EI in Australia. And so he arranged for the large group of sensei to come from Japan, and also facilitated the discussions that led to the appointment of the 2 technical advisors. And they were with us for over a decade as formal technical advisors, helping us through our training here, but also giving us an opportunity to go to Japan and train. So when I first went to Japan, I was training in Sendai and basically being supported by Nagayama Sensei. Stayed at his house or one of his apartments, trained in his dojo, and did my first Japanese grading, Jodo grading with. And I think that contact with Japan is invaluable as a result.
So going to Japan, staying there and doing this training means you're pretty serious by then. When did you realize that this was something that you would spend so much of your life doing?
Patrick, I'm not sure I ever did. I think I've got 20 years down the track and it's like, I've spent a lot of time doing this, haven't I? I think it's one of those things that almost creeps up on you. I referenced earlier that my starting martial arts predated Google. There's how do I put this? If you don't see good EI, how do you know what good EI really is? And I wanted to experience and see good Iaido, and I wanted to experience Iaido and Jodo in Japan. And I figured, this is the Japanese martial art. That's the source, if you like, of all of what we do. And to an extent, that was true. I saw some excellent EI in Sendai and some excellent Jodo, although that certainly increased significantly since I've been training in Kanagawa. I think that Kanagawa and the Tokyo region, it's even better. But going to Japan was a real eye-opener. And, after you go once, I pretty much have been most years since 2003, not every year, but most years. And I think it's a really important part of my training. I don't ever want Iaido to be seen as a non-Japanese art or something that we can manage without Japanese resources. We're just not skilled enough in Australia to do that. We don't have enough senior people. We don't have enough people who have that in-depth knowledge, particularly of Koryu, to drive us and to take us forward in our learning.
When the senseis come to do the seminar, is it always in the same place or does it move around?
No, so the seminar in 2000 was in Melbourne. That was a shorter event. And then after that, in 2001, we started moving it around so it would go around from capital city to capital city, with the exception of Adelaide and Darwin, where there is no EI to speak of, but every other capital city. So I think that also made it interesting for the sensei. They don't just have to come to the same place every year. It's been to Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Hobart, so all of the major capitals.
And how has that seminar changed over time?
The Kendo Federation, or Kendo Renmei's initial idea was to promote Iaido and Jodo. So they had this rotating schedule of half-day EI, half-day Jodo, which is a little bit disruptive. I think the theory was that people who do Iaido would see Jodo and want to take part and vice versa, and that's really never happened. But that seminar continued in that format for a long time, and really only in the last couple of years have we looked at, COVID issues aside, have we looked at moving it away from January, which was a very hot time of year in Australia. It's the middle of summer. It was always held over the Australia Day long weekend with the view that people would travel a bit more, and because it sort of doesn't get in the way of the teaching fraternity's holiday schedule. But we're moving it away from January now, and it's also been reorganised so that we have a concentrated block of Iaido and a concentrated block of Jodo with a Taikai and a grading between or at the end of each group, which I think is a lot more friendly to people travelling in this day and age. People's time is becoming more precious. Travel is expensive. Travel around Australia is expensive. Going from here to Perth is a 3.5 hour, 4 hour flight. So we're not talking about, it's a bit like Canada, I guess, going from one side of Canada to the other. We've got across the country and we've got up to Brisbane or Cairns or wherever we might be holding. So I think in terms of how it's changed, it's really been how our lives have changed. 20 years ago, it doesn't seem very long, but I mean, life was quite different 20 years ago in terms of pressures of work. And for a lot of us, I guess, family pressures, all those sorts of things. And taking a full week, full 7 days out of someone's schedule takes up a lot of holiday time. And I think that that's probably not something that people are as prepared to support now. And giving them the opportunity to have a 2-day seminar with a grading and a Taikai at the end, and then another 2-day seminar It's still largely the same time overall, but I think that it's very difficult to see a lot of strong growth. From my perspective, I've just moved my club from a fairly central location in Melbourne, much closer to where I live. I live on the outskirts of Melbourne. And one of the reasons for doing this was because I had attracted a membership from across the city. We've been through many different locations, about 5 different premises, but more recently for 12 years in one location, fairly close to the city centre. And that's great, people coming from all over the city. But it also means that we're training on the weekend. It's difficult to do evening trainings because people can't necessarily get there after work. And I wanted to see more of a community focus to my club. So I've moved the whole operation, COVID issues aside, we're not doing anything at the moment, down to close to where I live. And when the COVID restrictions lift, I'm going to be running Iaido and Jodo beginners courses and just promoting them within the area because we're in one of the biggest growth corridors in Melbourne down here on the outskirts. So there's a lot of development, a lot of people moving into the area. And because it's, we're 50 odd K from the city centre, we're not necessarily people who are going to travel into the city for something on a weekend. They might come and do an activity in the local area. So I'm hoping that this will mean that running introductory courses for both arts will actually help build more of a community base for the club rather than this sort of Melbourne-wide base that I've had since the 2000s.
Tell me a bit about some of your students that started over the last 20 or 16 years.
There's been, there's a lot. People come and go all the time. But I've still got students who were with me within the first few months of starting the club. I have 2 students now who are 4th dan, and they've both started as complete beginners. And so they've been with me, and a number of others too who've come along over the time. I've got 2nd dan, 3rd dan students who started with me and who've seen their entire EI career start and continue with me. So I'm particularly proud of the 2 4th dans. They've also been to Japan and trained with me in Kanagawa a few times, which is nice. And I'm also married to somebody who was one of my students. My wife is a 4th dan in Jodo and a 5th dan EI, and she came across from Western Australia, joined my club, and we're now a family. So it's nice to have that sort of support within your family too. As someone who was a former student, I don't know whether she'd be happy with me referring to her as a student, but she is.
That's an interesting story if you're willing to share how that relationship developed.
Sure. So Rebecca was a student of Ray Sensei, who runs one of the larger club groups in Western Australia. And she was from Singapore originally and had done her PhD at the University of Western Australia. And then was offered a posting here in Melbourne. And Ray said, well, when you go to Melbourne, I'd already met Rebecca a few times at national seminars, so I knew who she was. And Ray said, when you go to Melbourne, you have to go and train with Marcus. So she came across to Melbourne to take up her posting and ended up joining my club, training with me. And the rest, I suppose, is history. It wasn't that long before we were a couple, and we've now been married for more than 10 years. So, it's an enduring martial arts relationship, quite aside from our relationship as a couple. And she's very supportive of my life in the Iaido and Jodo. She's not training as actively now, largely due to work pressures, but it's good to have that level of support too. Someone who understands the time pressures of running a dojo and the commitment that's required to do that. I think that if you have a partner who understands that, it makes it a lot easier. In August last year, I went to Lee-Steere Sensei's 40th anniversary seminar in Eindhoven, and we managed to get sort of coincide that seminar with Rebecca doing some work in her scientific career with the University of Newcastle and then flying down to join me in Eindhoven. So we try and combine sort of, where we can, some work activity and some training for me, and then we went on and had a holiday afterwards. But we also did that in Japan. Had a couple of conferences in Japan where we've been able to combine some training in Kanagawa with her coming down earlier and going to her seminars and her conferences and then meeting up for training afterwards. But it alleviates the pressure on the travel budget, if nothing else. But it also, Australia's a long way from anywhere when it comes to travelling. So if you can combine some of these activities together, it becomes certainly more enjoyable to have company on the training and the travel. It helps me understand her life, and she can understand more about what's happening with my training. She's here training with me in Japan.
So with all these trips now that you've had, do you have any places that you like to go to or things you like to do that have become something that you regularly like to experience?
You mean apart from eating sushi?
And then,
sorry?
Well, even then, is there a sushi joint that you always go to when you visit a city?
There's a sushi restaurant in the shopping centre in Kanagawa called La Zona. It's a big, quite upmarket shopping centre, and there's a great sushi restaurant in the top floor of that shopping centre, where I've had many meals with various people from the dojo and with my sensei Loy, and drunk far too much sake. But no, I think most of my travelling to Japan has been about training. I've probably done a lot less sightseeing than I would have done ordinarily if I'd just been traveling for travel's sake. You go there, you train, then you fly back. We did climb Mount Fuji a couple of years ago, which was fun. That was a great challenge, and then went on to do some training afterwards. So again, combining conference travel or holiday travel. But I think our approach now is to try and, if we're going to go to Japan together, to try and do some sort of sightseeing to make it at least not all about the training. Still, training is very important, but to try and broaden the horizons a bit. And there's nothing I really do regularly. I think now, certainly since 2011, almost all of my trips have been to Kanagawa, and it's so close to Tokyo. It's a great location to base yourself in. It's a fairly buzzy area anyway. It's very close to the dojo, so I will almost always stay in one of the business hotels, Toyoko Inn, or one of those sorts of places. Cheap and cheerful, but very central in Kanagawa and easy to get to everywhere else, including up into Tokyo when I have some time off.
Tell me about the different schedules with the training, because they're obviously with different senseis and different dojos or seminars. You mentioned Sendai, Kanagawa was more recent one, and your CV showed some other seminars that you participated in.
Initially, so the first trip to Japan was with Nagayama Sensei, or went to visit and train with Nagayama Sensei in Sendai, and that really happened until the last trip up there was in 2011, and that coincided with me doing Jodo grading in further north in Akita. On that visit to Japan, I also, Lee Sensei had said, why don't I come to Kanagawa, train at Ishido Sensei's dojo, meet Ishido Sensei, see whether it might be a relationship worth developing, i.e. whether I would become a student of Lee Sensei. And so I did that, and that then changed my training regime. From then onwards, I didn't go to Sendai anymore. I only went to Kanagawa. So all of my training trips have been to Kanagawa, and Ishido Sensei has a full-time dojo. He teaches Iaido and Jodo, and there's a Kendo class there as well. So we basically go to the dojo for 4 to 5 days, train all day in Iai, and usually do Jodo in the evenings, a couple of evenings a week. And that's usually my sort of training regime now. When I was going to Sendai, it was much more varied. Nagayama Sensei had a dojo himself, and we would stay above. There was an apartment above the dojo, but we would go around to other dojo. It was a lot more varied. Now it's training in Ishido Sensei's dojo in Kanagawa. During the earlier days, I also went to a number of other seminars in Japan, all basically organized by Oda Sensei or Nagayama Sensei, mostly from an NEI perspective by Oda Sensei. So there was a number of different seminars around the southeast, the southern part of, or south of Tokyo anyway, that I went to. More recently, it's been events or seminars that are in Kanagawa. So there's been EI seminars I've taken part in there. And of course, very recently, as in last year, my first attempt at the Kyoto Enbu Taikai. So that was also a real challenge and great fun.
Let's talk about that. How did you plan for that? What were your expectations when you got there? What was the whole vibe around it?
I think it's phenomenal. They managed to get so many people through the event in a little more than half a day. I think it's something like 700 people are on the floor and off the floor in that time. So it's phenomenal with 2 courts running throughout the day, and you get everyone from all through the 6th dance, through the 7th dance, and the 8th dance and Hanchi. So their organizational skills are completely phenomenal. I don't know that I had any expectations. I think having taken 6th dan, but even before that, there's not an opportunity now. I mean, in Australia, we don't tend to compete in the Taikai beyond 4th dan because there's not enough people to make a reasonable competition. So my last EI Taikai in Australia was at 4th dan. And I think if you practice EI and Jodo to a degree, but certainly Iaido, you have to have something to focus your training on and something to test yourself. And I think that going to the occasional Taikai in Japan, which I've done, and going to Kyoto is a good way not only to test myself, but also as a focus for my training over a period of time leading up to that event. Otherwise, it's basically training every week and with no start or finish in that process. And I think it's important as an EI practitioner that I go and put myself out there and take part in these events, and take part in events with people who are at a similar level to me, at least at a similar grade, and also to watch the 7th dance and the 8th dance and see, what I'm aspiring to. Probably won't get 8th dan, but, hope to get 7th dan in a few years' time. So I think it's important for my own development to take part in those events. So I went there really with an open mind, but in the back of my mind thinking that this is something that I want to do between my 6th and 7th dan attempts. And it's something I want to do every year. It was going to happen again in May, but of course hasn't happened because of COVID-19, but hopefully next year.
So you're there and you're watching. Have you been to Kyoto Taikai before this?
Yeah, once back in maybe 2010, I think, a long time ago. So this was the first time I'd been since I'd watched it, when I was a lot more junior.
Any particular people or times that you thought were extra memorable or stood out in your mind? Yeah.
It's a bit like doing a grading. I think that you go out on the floor, you do your kata, and you step off the floor, and it's like, I almost don't remember what happened. I did catch the end of my scar in my sleeve at one point, very briefly, and managed to disengage that. And I'd been doing that in preparatory training too, which was even more annoying. You'd think I would have found a way to get around that. But anyway, I guess it wasn't to be. But that was a minor hiccup. But no, I don't have any... I think when you're sitting there through the entire day and you're watching these people, and you really do see the increase in skill level and the increase in application as you got through the grades. The 6th dans are all great. The 7th dans are great. The 7th dans, when they start, and you see the Kyoshi group, they're even better. And the 8th dan group is just awesome to watch. And I think you sit there through all those hours, you can really see the skill level grow as you watch the groups, but also the spirit and the focus. I mean, if you're a very old 8th dan EI practitioner, you may not be quite as sharp as you were when you were, 10 or 20 years younger, but there's still an enormous intensity and spirit that you see coming through on the floor. And I think it's a great privilege to be able to see that and to be able to watch those demonstrations.
You said that, well, especially at Kyoto Taikai, there's a lot of people coming from all over the world. Who are some of the people that you've met that aren't from Australia that you've gotten to know over time?
Not through the Taikai, but I mean, certainly Andy Watson Sensei, I met and have met several times in Kanagawa. People like Momiyama Sensei from Sweden, who's a great character. Again, I see him in the dojo in Kanagawa. I did my 6th dan grading with Stuart Sheriff from the UK, who's also an Asian practitioner. And then there's, people like Taya and Jonas from Finland. So I've met a lot of people really from going to the dojo in Kanagawa, more so. And then, of course, you see those people at gradings. I've been to watch the 6th, 7th dan gradings a number of times in Edogawa in Tokyo. So you see them there, and then you see them at the dojo, and then you see people at the Kyoto Taikai. I mean, I think one of your questions earlier was, how I'd become more exposed to the international EI community. And I guess it really has been through training in Kanagawa, because Iaido Sensei has such a number of people from all over the world, but particularly the UK and Europe. Renmei Sensei as well, trains there regularly as one of Ishido's students. So if I can go at the right time of the year, I get to see all of these people as well, which is great. And that facilitated my going to the seminar in Eindhoven, and was one of the reasons I wanted to go, because I'd met all of these people through my association with Iaido Sensei.
So meeting them in Kanagawa for training, it coincides with people going, or is there something happening?
No, it coincides with them going, or it doesn't sometimes. I mean, not every time I train in Kanagawa are there other people there. Sometimes there are. And I think it just coincides with what month we go. When I go to train in Kanagawa, I'm almost certainly going with Loi Sensei and some people from her dojo and some people from my dojo. So usually there's a group of 4, 5, 6, 7 of us going from Australia. And that's a decent number in the dojo. So we don't usually coincide completely with a large group from the UK, because we just wouldn't go train in the dojo. So I've tended to see these people occasionally, not every time I go. Sometimes there's a crossover. It doesn't usually coincide with an event, unless there's a grading happening and there's some of us practicing for gradings. So I did my 5th dan EI in Kanagawa, and a number of other people did at the same time. So I was there with some other people doing gradings from Europe. But generally speaking, it's a training visit, and we try to make our training visits not coincide with big groups from Europe, because it's difficult to get floor space in the dojo.
You mentioned that it's like 5 days in the week, and
yes,
you train every day. Maybe you could break down one day. What does that look like, from waking up to getting ready to training and then breaks? And what does one day of training look like?
So we usually start training at 10 and finish around 4. So it's we're not talking, like 12-hour days. It's get up, have breakfast, get the bus to the dojo, which is through the back streets of Kanagawa, arrive in plenty of time to get changed. We'll often be warming up or doing some pre-training before Iaido Sensei comes down. He lives upstairs. Then there's the usual formalities, Reiho to begin training and so on. And lunchtimes is either us going out to one of the restaurants nearby, or sometimes we'll have food brought into the dojo. But training is fairly casual. I would say that we all basically practice, and Iaido Sensei will walk around and provide pointers and tips depending on how we're going. Sometimes you'll get a lot of feedback, sometimes you won't get much. It just depends on what you're doing, and I think what he feels at the time that you need to learn or need to be pushed on. So there's no formal, I mean, in my club I run, we have a formal warm-up session to start with, or basic skills session, and we go through different stages. In training in Kanagawa, it's less of that and more you just train. Work on whatever you want to work on, and Iaido Sensei will provide feedback or not, depending on how he feels you're progressing. And we do that for 5 days. After training is time to sometimes have a beer. It's been known. Depends on the time of year too. Training in mid-year can be pretty hot in Japan. So I think in those times we will go and have a beer afterwards, which is, I think, medicinal for the most part. And then back to the hotel with dinner and hopefully several opportunities for sushi in the process as well. It's concentrated training, concentrated practice, but it's not the sort of training that I would have experienced in Australia at seminars. It's not a seminar approach. It's definitely dojo training where you basically train. Lee-Steere Sensei will either walk past and point something out or shout at you from across the room, or in my case, quite often laugh at me. Declare that I will never get it because I am a great big foreigner. And yeah, well, there you go. We still keep practicing, right?
So there's your group of travelers. Are there some of his students there too?
Yes, quite frequently. Locals, especially in the evenings. So he runs Iaido early week evenings, and some of them will come during the day, mostly the daytime trainings because they work in Japan. His students, they don't tend to turn up the daytimes. We'll see them in the evenings at the regular dojo practices. Same with Jodo. Jodo is on Tuesday evening. So we see the Jodo students at the Jodo practice and the EI students, Monday and Wednesday. Monday, Tuesday, Jodo's on Wednesday. So yeah, that's when the Iaido students come in. And not all of us will attend the evening sessions when we go as a big group, because again, I think it's, we're there, we have the benefit of Lee-Steere Sensei all throughout the week. I don't really want to make his students feel uncomfortable and take floor space away from them when they've often traveled a long way to get to the dojo.
Mm-hmm. What are a few things that you've gotten on these trips? Either something that you've realized on your own because you've had such a dedicated time training, or things you've heard from Lee-Steere Sensei or anyone else?
From my perspective, training at the dojo is both an opportunity for Lee-Steere Sensei to point out the numerous things that I don't get right in Seitei or Koryu. From a Koryu perspective, it's invaluable. There's nowhere in Australia, apart from when I go and visit Loy in Perth, there's nowhere in Australia that I can learn Koryu under anyone who's sort of skilled enough to pick up how I'm performing or not. And I think that the difficulty for a lot of non-Japanese is to understand what it means to learn Koryu from someone who is an acknowledged master of the art. You hear stories of people learning from books. You can learn the basic structure of a kata from a book, but you can't learn the meaning of the kata and all of the variations and why you do what you do. And I think that really there's a Shinden kata called Yamoroshi, and I think that one session a few years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, Lee-Steere Sensei was describing the different variations in the kata, and it just brought the kata to life in terms of why we do what we do, what the different moves mean, how you're responding to the opponent's moves, how you're exerting yourself in the kata. You really can't learn that from a book or watching a DVD or watching something on YouTube. So I think from my perspective, it's great to practice ZNKR kata, but for me, it's all about learning and trying to improve my Koryu.
You mentioned a couple of your students, the fourth dans, have come with you on trips before too. How did you explain to them why they should go, and what have you seen them gain from those trips?
I think for all of us going to Japan, it's about having your eyes opened to what excellent EI can be about. Not necessarily just the dojo practice. I mean, it's invaluable when you go along to Lee-Steere Sensei's dojo and take part in or even watch his regular students training in the evening, because there are some phenomenal Iaidoka there. Absolutely awesome technique. I think Australia's an isolated country for the best of times, and we're also isolated as a number of different geographically diverse groups. As I said, it's a 3.5, 4 hour flight to Perth. It's a couple of an hour or so to Sydney, a couple of hours to Brisbane. We don't get to these other communities very often. So we're practicing EI within our own relatively small group. To go to Japan, see phenomenal EI executed by people who are your age or in many cases a lot younger, it really puts in perspective your training, but it also gives you something to really work towards. You realize that there is something to this EI business, and that it is phenomenal when you see people doing EI at such a high level. So in terms of when I'm talking to students about going, it's all about that experience. Yes, they'll have some dojo time. Lee-Steere Sensei will help them through things, but a lot of it is about simply experiencing the life of training in Japan and having their eyes opened to really excellent Iaido and Jodo. And I think that's invaluable. And the difficulty for a lot of Australians who don't have that opportunity is that they never get to see what constitutes, a good performance or performing kata in an excellent way. And as a result, I think there's a danger that we become a bit insular, and that perhaps we think we're better than we are, and that we maybe don't need the training. And so seeing good examples is invaluable as part of their training process. And I think it's also nice that these guys to go and experience some Japanese culture too, share some that aforementioned sushi and sake with me. The dojo training is great. Seeing EI is great. And for some of them, the opportunity to take gradings in Japan too, I think it's been invaluable.
Mm-hmm. How would you compare your experience grading in Japan to Australia?
Apart from a lot more people.
That's a thing too.
It is, yeah. Again, it really takes you out of your comfort zone. I'd graded for years in Australia going through, we have a long Q grade system. I'm not sure what it's like in Canada, but we start people at 6Q. In Japan, they don't really start that low. And whether that's right or wrong, that's the system we have here. So, you go through all of these gradings from 6Q up to, in my case, before I did my 5th time in Japan, you're always with the people you see all the time. They're the same sensei on the grading panel every year because it's the same group of Japanese sensei and Australian seniors that sit on panels. And the people around you are all the people you train with all the time. You go to, for example, in my case, to Kanagawa and grade the 5th dan Iaido, and I don't know anyone, apart from the few people from the dojo that are there sort of supporting. And I think that it's a great experience. I mean, I really enjoyed it. But I think it's important at that level, for me, for 5th dan, as a preparation for doing 6th dan, obviously, a few years later, to go and experience that grading process in Japan. But I also, as I said to you earlier, I really value the connection we have with Japan and with senior sensei in Japan to be able to practice arts like Iaido and Jodo under their very close eye and sometimes under their criticism, which is understandable too.
Typically, because you guys have, as you were saying in Australia, your different relationships with senseis, who are the different groups of senseis and lines in Australia going from Japan?
Not everyone in Australia has that access or those links to Japan. I'm very lucky in that Loy offered to take me on, Loy Sensei offered to take me on as a student, and as a result, I get access to Lee-Steere Sensei's dojo and that lineage. None of the other club leaders in Melbourne really have anything like that strength of lineage through to Japan. One of the other 6th dans here does travel to Japan. She trains in a dojo somewhere near Tokyo, but beyond that, I don't think anyone else in Melbourne really has that strength of connection. And there are groups in Western Australia who also have different sensei relationships. But as I said, I think that Lee-Steere Sensei's group and that lineage is one of the strongest that exists for foreigners, at least in the Australian context. And I think that's sad that not everyone has that opportunity. But there are certainly relationships that exist for people in Sydney, some people in Queensland, but it's not universal by any means. So there might be one or two relationships in Sydney, there's myself here, there's people in WA, but not everyone in every group has that connection to be able to go and train in Japan, which I think is detrimental to development of the art here, but it's also very difficult to arrange. You sort of need to be invited to be able to go into these dojos. I think Kendo's a little freer, from what I understand. You can basically go to a Kendo club with a fairly loose-end introduction and train, and you're welcomed. It's very difficult to walk in the door of an EI dojo without any formal introduction to be able to train there. We were very lucky in Australia when we had, prior to Oda Sensei and Nagayama Sensei joining us as technical advisors, there was a Suyo Ryu Sensei called Kodono Sensei who went to Sydney for several years in a row. So they had a connection with the Suyo group there, and that still exists to a degree, but I don't know that it's as strong as it used to be. For those sort of 10 or 14 years or so that we had the technical advisors, that facilitated a number of us going to Japan. I went to both Sendai and I also went and stayed with Oda Sensei in Shizuoka. So I've had that access. When those people are no longer technical advisors, and unfortunately Oda Sensei passed away recently, then those opportunities vanish. But when we would have groups of sensei come out, I don't think we had less than 5 as a group, and that 5 would be Oda Sensei and Nagayama Sensei, and Igarashi-san from Nosyudo would come also. So he's been out to Australia since 2000 or close to that, pretty much every year, not so much recent, not in the last couple of years, but so he's been out here a lot. And then there would be 2 or 3 other more junior sensei in the group almost every year. And I think when they come as a group, there's there's a collegiate relationship. They're all friends, they all get on, they all stay in the same group of apartments. So there's that sort of company for that week that helps make the visit less culturally shocking, I suppose, than if you're traveling on your own. So in Perth, Loy has a relationship with Otake Sensei from a Jodo perspective, and he comes to Perth, or has come to Perth now for several years, every year in March. And I go across that Jodo seminar as well. But because he's a friend of Loy and he's a friend of Ishido Sensei, I think that in that context, it's a little bit different. So he enjoys going to Perth, and he enjoys the life in Perth and the summer and the beaches in the middle of the Japanese winter. But I think he's a rare example of someone who's happy to travel on his own and come out year after year after year as well, which we're very lucky. He's an excellent Jodo Sensei.
What were you looking forward to in 2020 and 2021 before COVID hit? And then now that it has, what are your plans?
Well, in terms of this year and 2021, I had hoped to go to the Kyoto Taikai in May this year. That clearly hasn't happened. I had hoped to go to Kanagawa for at least one session of training this year, and that hasn't happened. I have a 6-dan Jodo grading to challenge for, which I'm due to challenge for now. And the next opportunity for that is in January next year, and I just nil at this stage. When we're coming into August, Australia is still in lockdown, very much so in terms of international travel. Victoria, even more so at the moment, and that'll pass. But I'd be surprised if we get an opportunity to travel until at least 6 months of clear enough conditions in terms of the COVID-19 situation. So I think that the chance of being able to travel to Japan in January next year is fairly limited. Still hoping, very much hoping to get to the Kyoto Taikai next year. I hope that by May, at least that'll have things that have sorted themselves out. But I think, moving forward, I'd like to find opportunities to take part in more Taikai in Japan. I think, again, this is part of that process, or my process of development of wanting to challenge myself and experience different levels of training and under more pressure, which is partly what the Kyoto Taikai does, but also what happens in Taikai in general. We don't have that opportunity in Australia. And perhaps look at opportunities for attending more seminars in Europe. If I can coincide those with my wife's scientific adventures, all the better.
Anything else that when you were thinking about this interview that you thought would be interesting to share that you haven't been able to yet that you want to talk about?
I suppose just what I was talking about in terms of the nature of a country like Australia, where you have fairly isolated communities and not necessarily understanding what constitutes student versus sensei relationship. I particularly like Sensei Peter West, I've got to say, because his approach to EI and what he feels, particularly about the student-sensei relationship, really resonated with me. And it clarified a number of things in terms of how I feel about these things, which was interesting because I've been struggling with that concept, how to articulate that relationship, and he put it really nicely. I mean, he obviously has the experience, but he put it really nicely, and I appreciated that.
Were you thinking that more with your relationship with your senseis or your relationship with your students?
Both, really. I mean, when I started my own club, I had a lot of support to start it, but I'd been training only for a short period of time at that stage. Only a few years, and to go off and start your own club in your second dan, it wouldn't happen outside of an isolated community like Australia. So the way that I understand the student-sensei relationship now is very much informed by what Iaido Sensei says and his organizational structure down through his direct students, which is people like Lloyd Sensei, my sensei, and Andy Sensei, and Renmei, and all of those sorts of people. I'm Sensei now. And that sort of structure, which starts with him and percolates down through his direct students into those who have clubs under his students. And I like that approach. And I think back in the day when I started the Iaido, there was no explanation of anything like that. I was younger than I am now. And it took a long time before that sort of idea started to formulate, and really only through exposure to Iaido Sensei. And my perspective on that now is very much, I'm a student of Lee Sensei, she's a student of Iaido Sensei. That's how I fit into the structure of things. But that relationship I had with Lloyd didn't come about just organically. Lloyd Sensei and I had a long discussion about the fact that I needed to commit to training under Lloyd, even though I don't see her very often. She's still my sensei, that I needed to commit to being a member of her organization and of that lineage, and the responsibility that I have to stay within that lineage as a student of hers. And I don't think that understanding is necessarily common in all groups in Australia. And I think that it's very difficult for people to understand the nature of that relationship if they don't have someone to explicitly tell them about it. When I started doing EI 20 years ago, the highest EI practitioner in Australia, my instructor at the time, was a 5th dan. And he was the only 5th dan in Australia, and there was maybe a couple of 4th dans and some 3rd dans. That was it. We have now a number of 6th dans, 3 7th dans, and so on, but that's taken 20 years to develop. So that understanding of that relationship and how it might be different from club to club. As I said, I really found Sensei Peter West's discussion of the relationship interesting when he spoke about you have dojo members and you have students, and they're not necessarily the same thing. I think of my time back when I started EI, I was probably a dojo member of the Melbourne Kendo Club, not so much a student of the sensei of that club. But I don't know. That's one of those things that never really came up in conversation when I started my club back in 2004. I think with hindsight, maybe it was a bit arrogant of me to start my club then, but it was for the good in the general scheme of things. and I wouldn't necessarily have done it differently under the same circumstance. I think with hindsight, you make different decisions. But it's important to be true to the spirit of the art and to be true to the organization you're part of. And I think if you have that respect and you understand the relationship you have with your sensei, and you have a true student-sensei relationship, it really does open doors for you in Iaido and give you an access to training that you wouldn't ordinarily get. And I think that we're all different. I run my dojo in the way that I do within the lineage that I have access to, and how that fits into my beliefs in the way that I do. There are people in Melbourne who have different ideas of how to run a dojo and different understandings of their own lineage and their own place in that training structure, and that's cool. There are now 7 clubs in Melbourne that practice Iai to some extent. I'm sort of associated with 2 of them. I also teach at another club. And the other club and myself have the same philosophical approach, I suppose, to that structure of teaching. But there are other clubs that are different, and that suits their students too. And that sort of variety is very important. Otherwise, you all become the same. We don't want that. It's nice to have the variety, and people respond differently to different sorts of teaching. But I think in a lot of cases in sort of the Western context, you have to really be instructed in what it means to be a student of a sensei, if that relationship is to exist. You can't just assume it's going to be organic and somehow one morning I'm going to wake up and understand that I'm somebody's student or not, or that I am someone's sensei. And I think we take it for granted that information is out there, and I don't think it is as much as it should be.
What were some of the things that you discussed? You said you had a long conversation.
Really just about my obligation to her, and that I had to commit to her as my sensei, and that I had to support her in her teaching of me. And it's made clear, not just conversations with Loy, but I think it's also understood. It was made quite clear when I was in Eindhoven that your lineage is to your sensei, the person to that student of Iaido sensei that's running your part of that structure. And Loy basically alluded to that too, that's how I fit into the structure. And as a result, I don't go off randomly and practice other styles of Iai or seek teaching from other places. And if I want to do something with my Iai career, I would always talk to Loy first, and she would, if necessary, talk to Iaido sensei. And those sorts of communication lines are always open to make sure that I am part of the structure, but also that I can get the most benefit from the structure as well. I think there's a bit of a sense, it doesn't really happen in Australia, but it might happen in Europe, where people go to a seminar, they're instructed by someone, they instantly think they're a student of that someone. And I think that's probably what those conversations are about, about quashing, if you like. You're a student of your sensei if that relationship exists, and your sensei is a student of, in this case, Iaido sensei. Just attending a seminar doesn't make you a student of anyone necessarily. It means you attended the seminar. There may have been great teaching there, but that doesn't make you necessarily someone's student. And I think that sometimes in the Western context, that's misunderstood.
Why do you say that Australia, you don't have this issue?
Oh, because there's not this plethora of students of any particular sensei. So I have a relationship with Loy. Loy is a student of Iaido sensei. Even with the lineages that exist, I don't know of anyone else who has the same sort of structure in Australia that I'm part of or has access to that structure. So, you have people in clubs who will or will not consider themselves to be a sensei or a dojo member based on the relationship they have with that instructor. But I don't think there's anyone in Australia that I'm aware of that has quite that level of integration with an organisation that's headed by a sensei. Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting process. Mm-hmm. It really is.
Well, thank you so much. Great chatting with you, and hopefully we can meet in person sometime.
That would be great. Look forward to it. I at some stage, I'd love to get to Kendo. I'd love to get there at some stage. And if not, I'll probably see you tomorrow night on the Zoom call.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Patrick.
You too. See you later.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed that episode. The Inside Look podcast is a production of Chikushinkai Canada and is available on most podcast platforms and on YouTube. Don't forget to subscribe and be notified when new episodes are published. You can also learn more about us by subscribing to our newsletter at subscribe.chikushinkai.ca or connect with us on Facebook and Instagram at chikushinkai.canada. We're always looking for ways to improve, so please drop us a line on ideas for the show. And until next time, practice hard and practice often. Bye-bye now.